The music box was always under the tree on Christmas morning. Nobody put it there. Nobody wound it up. But every Christmas, at exactly 3:33 a.m., it would play Silent Night in a child's voice. This year, Emily's daughter asked why the voice was calling her name.
Emily.
The Haunting Hour. The package arrived on December 1st, wrapped in faded brown paper and tied with fraying twine that looked decades old. Sarah Matthews stood in her grandfather's Victorian mansion's foyer, turning the unexpected delivery over in her hands. The return address was smudged, but she could make out Quinn's Antiques in faded ink. Inside, she found an ancient-looking ornament box and a letter written in her grandfather's shaky handwriting, postmarked just days before his death 3 months ago. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and you've inherited both the mansion and its burden. The box contains the last of your grandmother's Christmas collection, 12 crystal ornaments that have been in our family for generations. I've protected you from their truth your entire life, but now you must know. Your grandmother didn't abandon us 50 years ago, as you were told. She became part of the collection, just like the others before her." Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted the ornament box's tarnished lid. Inside, nestled in age-darkened velvet, lay 12 exquisite Victorian-era glass ornaments, each one uniquely crafted and displaying a disturbing level of detail. The first depicted a woman's face, her expression frozen in a silent scream, the glass somehow capturing the terror in her eyes with unsettling precision. Her grandfather's letter continued. "The ornaments are bound to our bloodline. Each Christmas Eve, they must be hung by midnight, or their power grows hungry. But beware, they must never be hung by someone alone. The collection needs a witness, someone to share the burden, or it will claim another soul for its display." Sarah almost dropped the box when she noticed the face in the first ornament looked eerily like the grandmother she'd only seen in photographs. She slammed the lid shut, but not before seeing the other faces in the collection, each one trapped in various states of horror or despair. Despite her instincts screaming to burn the box and run, Sarah knew she couldn't. The mansion had been in her family for generations, and with it came responsibilities she was only beginning to understand. She called her best friend Emma immediately, but Emma's phone went straight to voicemail. A text revealed she was stuck in Chicago due to a massive snowstorm. Her cousin Michael was traveling abroad, and her other relatives had stopped visiting the mansion years ago, claiming it gave them nightmares. As December progressed, Sarah dove into research, spending countless hours in her grandfather's library. She discovered diary entries dating back to 1853, when her great-great-great-grandfather first acquired the ornaments from a mysterious merchant who vanished shortly after the sale. Each generation had lost at least one family member to the collection, their disappearances always occurring on Christmas Eve. She found her grandfather's personal journal, its pages filled with detailed accounts of his attempts to break the curse. He'd consulted mediums, paranormal investigators, and even a Vatican exorcist, but nothing had worked. The ornaments had to be hung each year, or they would claim random victims from the surrounding town, instead of limiting their hunger to the family. Sarah spent weeks trying to find someone to help her with the decoration ritual, but a record-breaking blizzard had isolated the mansion. Roads were closed, power lines were down, and she couldn't even get an internet connection to research further. As Christmas Eve approached, She watched with growing dread as the ornaments began to glow faintly in their box, pulsing like heartbeats. On December 24th, at 11:30 p.m., Sarah stood alone before the massive Christmas tree in the mansion's grand parlor. The antique silver star, the one her grandmother had been holding when she vanished, sat on a nearby table, its surface reflecting the room in disturbing ways, showing shadows where there should be light and movement, where there should be stillness. That's when the singing began. At first, it was distant, like a radio playing in another room, the familiar notes of Silent Night drifting through the walls. But there was something wrong with the voices. They harmonized too perfectly, with an otherworldly resonance that made Sarah's teeth ache. She checked every room, but the singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The ornaments in the box began to chime in response to the caroling, their crystalline surfaces vibrating with increasing intensity. Sarah knew she was out of time. The collection had to be hung, or the consequences would be dire. Her grandfather's journals had detailed what happened the 1 year his grandfather had refused to hang them. 12 children from the nearby town had vanished without a trace. With trembling hands, she began to hang the ornaments, trying to ignore the faces that seemed to follow her movements. Each one she touched sent a jolt of ice through her fingers, and the singing grew louder with each placement. By the 11th ornament, the voices had reached a fever pitch, and she could see figures in her peripheral vision, Victorian-era men and women in their Christmas finest, their forms transparent, but becoming more solid with each passing second. As she reached for the final ornament, the one bearing her grandmother's face, the grandfather clock began to strike midnight. The carolers materialized fully, forming a circle around her. She recognized their faces from the ornaments that now hung on the tree, each one bearing the same haunted expression she'd seen in the glass. Her grandmother stepped forward, more solid than the others, her form glittering with frost. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice carrying the echo of broken glass. "We've waited so long for you to join our choir." Sarah tried to run, but her feet had begun to crystallize, transforming into the same ethereal glass as the ornaments. The carolers' song reached an impossible crescendo, their voices weaving together in an ancient melody that predated Christmas itself. She felt her skin hardening, becoming transparent, her very essence being pulled into the final empty ornament that waited on the tree. That's when the front door burst open. Emma stood in the doorway, covered in snow, her rental car abandoned in a drift at the gate. She had driven through the blizzard, sensing something was wrong, when Sarah had stopped responding to texts. The carolers' song faltered for a moment, their forms wavering. "Together," Sarah's grandmother cried, but her voice held a note of desperation now. The ritual must be completed alone. In that moment of confusion, Emma lunged forward and grabbed Sarah's crystallizing hand. The contact broke, whatever spell had been weaving itself around her friend. Sarah felt warmth returning to her limbs as the transformation reversed. The carolers howled in frustration, their forms beginning to fade, but they weren't giving up easily. The silver star atop the tree began to pulse with a sickly blue light, and the ornaments started to shatter one by one, releasing their trapped souls into the room. The carolers' bodies became more solid as they absorbed the freed spirits, their song transforming into something ancient and terrible. Sarah remembered one last entry from her grandfather's journal, a theory he'd never had the chance to test. "The collection's power lies in isolation," he'd written. "Perhaps its opposite, true connection, could break its hold. As the carolers closed in, Sarah and Emma began to sing. Not the haunting carol that filled the room, but Deck the Halls, the silly version they'd made up in 3rd grade. Their voices, imperfect and human, clashed with the otherworldly harmony. Other voices joined in. Sarah's phone was ringing, its speaker filling the room with a video call from her cousin Michael and his family, all singing their own carols in different time zones. The dissonance grew as more calls came in. The isolation that had given the collection its power was shattered by technology, by friendship, by family choosing to reach out across any distance. The carolers' perfect harmony faltered and broke. One by one, they dissolved into mist, pulled back into the remaining ornaments, which fell from the tree and shattered against the floor. All except one, the ornament containing Sarah's grandmother. As the others broke, her form became fully solid for a moment. She smiled, a real smile this time, and whispered, "Thank you for breaking our chain." Then she too faded away, leaving behind nothing but a single glass tear that crystallized into a perfect snowflake as it hit the ground. Sarah and Emma collapsed onto the sofa, exhausted but alive. The phones kept ringing as more family members joined the impromptu carol session, their voices filling the mansion with warmth and life. For the first time in over a century, the house felt like a home again. They stayed up until dawn, singing every Christmas song they could remember, proper lyrics forgotten in favor of made-up verses and laughing corrections. When the sun rose, Sarah hung the crystallized tear on a new tree, one she and Emma had decorated together with bright, modern ornaments ordered online. The mansion still stands, and every Christmas Eve, it fills with song. But now, it's the joyful noise of the living. Family and friends gathering to celebrate together, their imperfect voices joining in carols that chase away any lingering shadows. And if sometimes, in quiet moments, visitors think they hear a single ethereal voice joining in from somewhere far away, well, that's just part of the magic of Christmas. The silver star and the fragments of the cursed ornaments were sealed in blessed silver and buried under the new garden Sarah planted in the spring. Some say that's why her roses bloom even in December, their petals sparkling with an otherworldly frost. But the only collection she keeps now is of memories, captured in photographs of smiling faces and recorded videos of terrible but enthusiastic singing. Every year, more people join their Christmas Eve celebration. The mansion's windows glow with warm light, and the sound of laughter and off-key carols spills out into the winter night. And if you pass by, you might be invited in to join the song, but only if you promise to sing badly, laugh often, and never ever decorate a Christmas tree alone. Years later in Quinn's Antiques, a small box wrapped in brown paper sits on a dusty shelf, waiting. Inside, 12 empty ornaments gleam with possibility, their surfaces reflecting faces that aren't quite there. But that's a different story for a different Christmas Eve. Now the next story will tell my small brother. The old Philco radio hadn't worked since 1943, or at least that's what the tag said at Mason's antique shop. Lily Jang traced her fingers over its worn wooden cabinet, feeling the history in every scratch and dent. She shouldn't be spending her savings on broken antiques, not when the pediatric ward needed so many actual supplies. But something about this particular radio called to her. "That's an interesting piece," Mr. Mason said, adjusting his thick glasses. "Belonged to a World War II veteran named Thomas Wheeler. Story goes he used to play it every Christmas Eve for the Children's Hospital, back when this building was the Old Saint, Mary's Medical Center. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She was the head nurse at the new children's hospital across town, the one that had replaced St. Mary's after the fire in 1985. "I'll take it," she said, before she could change her mind. Her Christmas bonus would cover it, even if it meant postponing her car repairs for another month. The radio was heavier than it looked, and by the time she'd carried it up to the hospital's long-term care ward, her arms were aching. The children watched curiously as she placed it on the nurse's station counter, its dark wood contrasting with the modern medical equipment surrounding it. "What's that, Miss Lily?" asked Marcus, one of her favorite patients. At 8 years old, he'd already spent more time in hospitals than most people do in their entire lives. His latest round of treatment wasn't going well, and he hadn't smiled in days. "This," she said, giving the cabinet an affectionate pat, "is a Christmas miracle in the making." She didn't know why she said that. The radio was just a nostalgic impulse buy, nothing more. Yet something about it felt right, sitting there among the beeping monitors and fluorescent lights. That night, as she was finishing her paperwork, she could have sworn she heard music coming from the radio, just a faint whisper of White Christmas beneath the static. But when she checked, the plug wasn't even in the wall. Must have been her imagination, or maybe sound bleeding through from someone's phone. The next few days were brutal. 3 new admissions, 2 emergency surgeries, and Marcus's condition worsening despite everyone's best efforts. His parents had been at his bedside for 48 hours straight, their faces drawn with worry. Christmas Eve was tomorrow, and instead of excitement, the ward was heavy with fear and exhaustion. That's when Lily remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell about the power of Christmas Eve, how the veil between worlds grew thin, allowing miracles to slip through. After her shift ended, she stayed behind, cleaning the old radio with gentle hands. The wooden cabinet began to glow subtly under her touch, or maybe it was just the reflection of the Christmas lights from the nurse's station. She found the radio's power cord coiled inside the cabinet, surprisingly intact for its age. Against her better judgment, she plugged it in. Nothing happened at first, but as the hospital grew quiet and Christmas Eve crept closer, she heard it. A faint crackle of static, then a voice cutting through time itself. "Good evening, St. Mary's," the voice said warmly. "This is Captain Thomas Wheeler, broadcasting on Christmas Eve, 1943. To all our young patients fighting their own battles while their brothers and fathers fight overseas, this program is for you." Lily froze. The voice was crystal clear, as if it were being broadcast today. More incredibly, she could hear children's voices in the background, laughing, asking for their favorite songs. The radio's dial moved on its own, numbers glowing with a soft blue light that shouldn't have been possible through decades of dust and disuse. She wasn't the only one who heard it. Down the hall, doors began to open. Parents and children emerged from their rooms, drawn by the music and the inexplicable warmth that seemed to radiate from the old Philco. Marcus wheeled himself out, his face brightening with the first real interest she'd seen in weeks. The voice from 1943 continued, "Tonight, we have a special guest, Private James Collins, who just returned from the front. He's brought his trumpet, and he's taking requests." What followed was impossible, yet Lily witnessed it with her own eyes. As the trumpet played Silent Night, the medical equipment's harsh beeping softened, harmonizing with the music. The fluorescent lights dimmed, replaced by what looked like old-fashioned Christmas lights that hadn't hung in this building for nearly 80 years. Children from different eras seem to flicker in and out of existence. Some in 1940s hospital gowns, others in clothes from various decades, all singing along with the broadcast. They weren't ghosts, exactly, but rather echoes of every Christmas Eve this building had ever seen, all happening simultaneously. The night shift staff gathered around, nobody daring to speak as the radio bridged decades of hope, healing, and holiday magic. Modern medical monitors displayed impossible readings, their screen showing Christmas greetings in vintage typefaces. The very air felt charged with something that defied scientific explanation. Marcus wheeled closer to the radio, his eyes wide with wonder. A boy in a 1940s hospital gown smiled at him and held out a hand. They touched fingers, and for a moment, their forms merged. When they separated, some of the old-fashioned boy's healthy glow remained with Marcus, bringing color back to his pale cheeks. Through the radio, Captain Wheeler's voice crackled. Remember, children, healing comes in many forms. Sometimes it's medicine, sometimes it's music, and sometimes it's the magic that happens when hope and history dance together on Christmas Eve. The broadcast continued until midnight, playing requests from children past and present. Each song carried memories of other Christmas Eves, other children, other healings. Modern medical charts updated themselves, showing subtle but undeniable improvements in every patient who'd heard the music. As Christmas Day dawned, the radio fell silent, but its magic lingered. Marcus's latest tests showed an unexpected improvement. Small, but significant. Other patients reported feeling better, their vital signs stronger. The entire ward felt transformed, as if decades of healing energy had condensed into a single night of wonder. Radio never played again, at least not until the next Christmas Eve. But its presence became a symbol of hope in the children's ward. Someone wrote down Captain Wheeler's story, and it became a hospital legend. Children would touch the radio for luck before procedures, and parents would sit beside it during long nights, drawing comfort from its silent wisdom. Years later, when Lily finally retired, she left the radio to the hospital. By then, Marcus was a doctor himself, having beaten his childhood illness against all odds. He kept the old Philco in his office, and on Christmas Eve, he would gather the children to tell them about the night when time itself took a break to listen to Christmas carols. Some say that if you visit the hospital on Christmas Eve, you can still hear echoes of that 1943 broadcast. The old radio sits in its place of honor, surrounded by modern medical marvels, bridging the gap between science and miracle. And sometimes, when hope is needed most, its dial still moves on its own, seeking frequencies that exist somewhere between faith and memory. In the hospital records, there are countless unexplained recoveries dated December 25th across the decades. The official reports cite various medical reasons, but the unofficial stories all mention music from an old Philco radio, playing songs that carry the healing power of every Christmas Eve that ever was or will be. The antique shop where Lily found the radio is still there, its shelves filled with objects, waiting to find the right person at the right moment. Mr. Mason claims he doesn't remember selling her the radio, but he always smiles when new customers ask about Christmas miracles. After all, every antique has a story, and some stories are still being written, one Christmas Eve at a time. Now the next story will tell my small, small brother. Old Heinrich's clock shop sat at the corner of Pine and Market Streets for as long as anyone could remember. The narrow Victorian building leaned slightly to one side, its windows filled with timepieces of every description, from delicate pocket watches to towering grandfather clocks. But it was the special clock in the front window that drew people's attention every Christmas. A massive advent calendar clock with 24 tiny doors, each hiding a different marvel of miniature clockwork. Clara Foster hurried past the shop on December 1st, already 10 minutes late for her shift at the diner, when something made her stop. The advent clock in the window was different this year. Instead of its usual gleaming brass face, it looked ancient, as if it had aged decades overnight. The Roman numerals were tarnished, and frost patterns spread across its glass face like silver ferns. Beautiful, isn't it? Clara jumped. Old Heinrich stood beside her, though she hadn't heard him approach. He looked different too, older somehow, his silver hair longer than she remembered, his eyes holding an odd, crystalline gleam. "I haven't seen this one before," Clara said, studying the clock's intricate details. Each of the 24 tiny doors was carved with a different scene from Christmas stories throughout history. "It's been in my family for generations," Heinrich said, his German accent thicker than usual. "Legend says it was crafted by my great-great-grandfather in the Black Forest. He claimed it could show you the Christmas you needed to see, past, present, or future." He chuckled. "But only if you open the right door at exactly the right moment." Clara smiled politely, already turning to leave. She didn't have time for fairy tales. Her mother's medical bills were mounting, the diner was cutting hours, and Christmas was looking bleaker by the day. "Perhaps you'd like to wind it." Heinrich held out an ancient key, its brass surface etched with snowflakes. "It needs to be wound every day of December, and my hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Before Clara could refuse, her phone buzzed. A text from her manager. "Diner closed due to burst pipe. No shifts today." She stared at the message, calculating how much money she'd lose, when Heinrich pressed the key into her hand. "I can pay you," he said quietly. "Not much, but enough to make it worth 10 minutes of your time each morning." That's how Clara became the keeper of the Advent clock. Each morning, she would arrive at the shop before dawn, use the ornate key to wind the mechanism, and watch as the clockwork came to life. Heinrich never seemed to arrive until after she finished, though she never saw him enter the shop either. On December 12th, something changed. As she turned the key, one of the tiny doors swung open on its own. Inside, instead of the expected clockwork figure, she saw what looked like a window into another time. A young woman in Victorian clothing sat at a workbench, carefully assembling a pocket watch. With a start, Clara recognized her own features in the woman's face. The scene shifted, showing the same woman teaching her craft to others, building a life one gear and spring at a time. Clara felt knowledge flowing into her mind. The proper way to hold watchmaking tools, the secrets of calibrating delicate mechanisms, the mathematics of time itself. Each morning after that, a different door opened, showing her glimpses of lives connected to her own through time and craft. She saw her grandfather, who had died before she was born, working as a mechanic and dreaming of building watches. She saw her mother, younger and healthy, crafting jewelry with the same precise attention to detail Clara now found herself developing. Heinrich began teaching her between these visions, showing her how to repair the simpler clocks in his shop. Her fingers seemed to know what to do before he explained, as if she'd done this work in another life. Soon, she was earning more from clock repair than she ever had at the diner. On December 23rd, Heinrich wasn't in the shop. Instead, she found a letter in elegant handwriting. Time is the greatest gift we can give each other. Open the final door at midnight on Christmas Eve if you dare to see your own time stream. Clara spent that day fixing clocks and wondering what to do. The practical part of her said this was all an elaborate dream, that the visions were stress-induced hallucinations. But her hands, growing stronger and more skilled with each timepiece she repaired, told a different story. At 11:59 p.m. on Christmas Eve, she stood before the Advent clock. All 23 doors hung open, each showing a different moment in time. As midnight struck, the final door swung wide, and Clara found herself falling through time itself. She saw her mother, healthy again, teaching clockmaking to eager students. She saw herself, older and confident, running the shop with Heinrich's sign still above the door. She saw children gathering at the window each Christmas, pointing at the marvelous Advent clock that somehow never aged. More importantly, she saw the pattern, how each life touched others, how skills and dreams passed from generation to generation like the ticking of a perfect clock. She saw how Heinrich had guided others before her, each chosen because they needed to discover something about their own time. When the vision faded, Clara stood in the shop alone. On the workbench lay another letter, this one written in Heinrich's familiar hand. My dear Clara, time has a way of finding the right moment to reveal our true paths. The shop is yours now, as it was always meant to be. The Advent clock will guide you to others who need to find their time, just as you did. Take care of them, and remember, every life is like a clock. What matters isn't how long it runs, but how well it keeps time while it's winding. Merry Christmas, Heinrich. Below the letter was a deed to the shop, dated 1943, with Clara's name written in fresh ink. Next to it sat a pair of watchmaker's glasses and a set of tools that felt perfect in her hands. The Advent clock chimed midnight again, though Clara was sure more than an hour had passed. Outside, snow began to fall, and she saw her reflection in the window. Or perhaps it was her great-great-granddaughter's, or her great-great-grandmother's. In matters of time, she was learning. Such distinctions didn't always matter. She opened the shop on Christmas morning, though she hadn't planned to. People seemed to know to come, bringing their broken timepieces and their stories. Clara fixed what she could, and for those hurts that couldn't be mended with gears and springs, she listened. Sometimes that was the greatest gift of time, the moments we spend truly seeing each other. Years passed, and Clara became known as the Clockmaker, who could fix anything that ticked. Children pressed their noses against her window each December, watching the Advent clock's doors open to show different wonders each year. Some of them would return as adults, drawn by memories they couldn't quite explain, to find their own paths through time. And if sometimes, in the early morning hours, people saw two clockmakers working side by side in the shop, a young woman with skilled hands and an old man with silver hair, well, time has its own ways of keeping its craftsmen company. They say, if you visit old Heinrich's clock shop, though the sign now reads, Clara's Timepiece Repair, you might catch a glimpse of yourself in the Advent clock's reflection, not as you are, but as you could be, once you find your own time. But be careful what doors you open in December. Some moments, once seen, have a way of ticking forward into reality, one carefully wound day at a time.